Hey, thanks for coming to listen to the interview with Melissa Waage. It's a great interview, great conversation. There were some video and audio issues, which you'll probably hear, but it's a great conversation, and Melissa's full of wisdom and insights, and so I hope you enjoy the show. Thanks.
The best leaders go in maybe with a pretty good idea where they can get going, but a total openness to hear from other experts around the table, their thoughts, and to synthesize that into a plan that everyone sees themselves in and agrees with. Not going in with a totally empty mind and blank slate, like, what are people going to tell me? It's going in with a hypothesis, but being willing to adjust that hypothesis based on what you hear from your colleagues.
Today, we're talking with Melissa Waage, who is Vice President of Advocacy and Engagement for Sandy Hook Promise. Before that, Melissa and I worked together at the Natural Resources Defense Council for 15 or 16 years. And Melissa worked on advocacy for the Center for Biological Diversity, U.S. PIRG, and Green Corps. And she also served on the board of Eco Women. Melissa has worked on clean energy, dirty energy, mountaintop removal, antibiotics and meat, clean water, and more. She was so instrumental at NRDC that after she left, when people got stumped with what to do next, they would ask, what would Waage do? She's a friend, a brilliant campaigner, and a terrific colleague. And I am so glad to have you on the pod, as they say. Melissa, welcome.
It's awesome to be here, Pete. Nice to see you.
Thank you. Thank you. You've got over 20 years experience advocating and campaigning on environmental issues. Tell us how you found your way into the work.
I always cared about the environment. I grew up in East Tennessee, climbing trees, wading in creeks, and really valuing the world around me. And also growing up in Appalachia, seeing what can go wrong when environments are polluted and the needs that we have for them are not respected. So I went into college with that consciousness. But I did not set out to be an organizer or campaign or anything like that. I saw environmental work as sort of a volunteer effort. So I, was active in the campus environmental club, and I took a lot of environmental studies classes, and I actually wanted to be a journalist. But then my senior year of college, George W. Bush was elected president, and immediately started doing things that upset me greatly, because these were things, environmental issues that I had worked on, I cared about. I had gotten thousands of postcards signed to protect the roadless rule, and that was one of the first things he wanted to roll back. So I was really ready to hear from a Green Corps recruiter who gave me a call. I went through that interview process. It's a 1-year training program in grassroots environmental organizing. And I thought, you know what? I just have to go do this for a year. Maybe this won't be my thing. I'm just going to go, do a little bit of service on this. But it turns out I absolutely fell in love with organizing. 20-some years later, here I am still doing it. I think that for a lot of us, that was kind of jumping in and learning how to swim very quickly. Yeah. And it set the stage, I think, for a lot of folks of my generation in terms of what we would be dealing with if we really wanted to protect the climate.
A lot of people have different ways of defining what a campaign is and what a strategy is. How do you define those terms?
I believe that a campaign can mean many things. I've worked with people in the marketing space. They mean one thing when they talk about a campaign. You work with people in the development and fundraising space. That campaign is something different. In the organizing and advocacy space, I simply call it a set of activities strategically put together to move towards a specific goal. When I used to do a lot of presentations to new organizers about what a campaign is, I did like to go back to the etymology. And so campaign, it comes from, Latin, campagna, the plain, the field of battle. It's a fight to get towards a goal, usually overcoming opposition, right? That spins off many, many different variations, but that's what it is to me.
And how about a strategy? How do you define strategy to people when you're talking about we need to come up with one?
For achieving your goal.
Simple.
It's as simple as that.
Neat.
Yeah.
Do you have like a particular or standard approach to a campaign strategy?
We all have different templates. We have different ways that we walk people through a campaign strategy, but it's pretty simple. What is the goal? Specific, time-bound, measurable thing that you want to achieve. Step 1. Step 2, who can deliver that goal? Who decides whether that thing happens or not? Piece of legislation, most likely it's the members of a legislature that are going to be voting yes or no. Administrative action, at a state level, government level, it's the principal, the governor, the president, and directly under them, the agency staff, et cetera, the folks that will actually make the decision. This is, I think, a really important thing to dig into, though, because I think sometimes we might be talking through something and assume that the president has the ultimate power, the principal, when really it might just be one particular person that's in one particular place in the bureaucracy who actually really is the person, whether that's written on paper or not, but is the person that you have to convince to make the decision that delivers your target. And then the question is about what do those targets need to move in our direction and make the decision that we want to make? And that is how strategy is born. What's usually more complicated than we need thousands of people to write them a letter. There's usually a lot of dimensions there that some are kind of obvious on the surface, but remembering that we're always talking about people. And so it's often more complicated. I think the more insight you can get into how your target thinks and what their motivations are, the better. In that way, I think campaign strategy really kind of like wends into the world of psychology at times.
There's a lot to unpack there. Explain time bound.
A good goal is one that you know when you've reached it, right? And it's something that you can reach. I think sometimes we set very aspirational goals, world peace, a totally carbon-free economy, that are things that probably can happen someday, but I'm not going to wait around. That's a thing we want. The pathway to that is not entirely clear at this point. I think for a good goal, you need a clear pathway, a relatively clear, at least directional pathway to this is a thing that can happen. And the time bound is so that we can do it and we know that we've done it. It's achievable, right? That goal of total world peace is not time bound because I hope that is something possible someday, but I certainly don't think anyone could assign a time frame to that. Oftentimes you kind of want to refine your goals if you're looking for something that you realize really isn't time bound, isn't that specific, isn't that achievable. You may just need to edit and adjust and articulate a goal that is all of those things.
And often the time boundary is set by, say, a legislative campaign. It may be set by who's the president or who's the governor,
right?
Who are the electeds.
It could be set by political process, right? Like this is the term of Congress where we believe we have the Congress that could pass this bill. We're not so sure about next Congress. We've got to get the bill passed in the next 2 years. It can also be attached to, real material circumstances. If we know what the tipping point is for, the absolute worst impacts of global warming, that is related to how fast we are pushing carbon into the air and how, the passage of time. And so, of course, a lot of our big goals and targets around climate change are based on this reality that we have a pretty good idea of what happens on the Earth at different concentrations of carbon in the atmosphere. Those are kind of on two different scales, the physical world and the political world.
You mentioned something talking about targets, like sometimes you find that it's not actually the person you think it is, it's somebody in their staff. Or how do you find that out? Is that something that you find out at the beginning, or is it the kind of thing you find out once you're underway and you start to learn more and more about what's actually driving decisions?
The more you can figure that out before you launch a campaign, the better. But of course, a lot of this stuff, some of the things we do during campaigns is to kind of test that, right? If we don't have full, complete information about what this person is thinking and what they care about, then you can try different things and see if it nudges at all, if you get any reaction or any change. But, there's a lot of way to get this information. Some of it is just in the public domain, right? You can read the writings and listen to the speeches and the conversations of this person that you're targeting. You can look at previous history. Who did they listen to and what mattered in this last decision that they had to make? You can reason from the underlying circumstances. Okay, I have a lawmaker who represents Alaska. They're worried about their tax base if we are talking about curtailing oil and gas production, right? I think it's always worth digging the next level deeper. I don't know how much this happens anymore, but there was a time when Senator Jay Rockefeller of West Virginia was gettable on a number of energy issues despite representing a coal state. And this was, because he was a man who respected and listened to science. But I also remember that he had family members, children that felt strongly about the issue. And that kind of thing can be out there. I think, use absolutely every tool at your disposal to get those insights. In the end, if you can't get those super deep psychological insights, the best you can do is kind of underline, previous behavior, previous statements, underlying behavior. And then I would like to highlight that our partners doing legislative advocacy, doing the on-the-ground lobbying are really critical for this part of campaigning because they're the folks that get that inside intel, whether it's, it's the word is out on the hill or it's simply, speaking to a staff person and them telling them, frankly, listen, my boss wants to do this, but we're going to have to hear from so-and-so or whatever it is. Understanding that is really key.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned the importance of prep work, and you've quoted a statement attributed to Abe Lincoln saying, if I'm given 6 hours to chop down a tree, I'm going to spend the first 4 sharpening the axe and then 2 hours chopping. So talk about that in terms of like how important the prep is for a campaign.
It's super important. We can get a little too carried away in prep. And my other favorite saying is that don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. First of all, there's the research. There's the understanding. Is our goal right? Have we actually thought through what's going to get us to our goal? Do we really understand this target? Is it the right target? Figuring all of that out. But I really look at campaigns, and the longer I do this, the more true this is. Almost like setting out to write a novel or a screenplay. Because when we're talking about engaging the public, engaging grass tops leaders, lots of, different types of people around the country or the world. We really need to tell them a good story and make them part of that story and hear how they want to be part of that story. And so that means really thinking through, okay, we pass this bill, then what? Or try to pass the bill and we fail. What does that feel like for all the people that have spent their time, their energy, their money, whatever else on this fight? And you really have to think about the choose your own adventure of how that story spins out. I sometimes like to sit down and tell the story ahead of time. In my perfect world, how would the story go? It has a beginning, it has a middle, it has an end. It has 3 acts, right? So the first act, you're establishing the characters and the conflict. In the second act, you're having most of the action. In the third act, you're having the resolution and the denouement at the very end. Thinking that through is very helpful, and it'll help you set things up at the beginning of the campaign that are going to be helpful at the end. That Chekhov's gun of whatever it is.
Right. Is there an example of a campaign where that process and figuring out the essential elements was pretty straightforward and that worked out? And then are there times when either things turn out to be very different from what you expected, or just there are certain challenges in the planning process in terms of being able to identify maybe something about the targets or how you're going to influence them, and it's more like, well, we're going to try things out and kind of adjust as we go?
No, I think a great example of kind of both of those things happening at once might be the Inflation Reduction Act. That was a long, twisty story with a lot of filler material, right? And that was really challenging. I don't know how much better we could have done at setting up a story for that because there were so many variables in play. And I don't think we fully predicted quite how narrow our target universe was going to be. And so this is something that I think we are confronting, and that is the case across the board. Almost any topic you're working on now, any campaign, we're going to run up against this in the U.S. Congress because there is such political polarization across the two parties, and the margins are so narrow that it really means that we lack a lot of what would swing votes in the past. Moderate Republicans and moderate Democrats that used to reach across the aisle and being willing to sit down and compromise and vote on something that didn't hit everybody's requirements, but moved something forward. And now we just have much further lines on both the right and the left and much less room. And then with the margin for control, oftentimes being 1 or 2 votes these days. So with the Inflation Reduction Act, it ended up being Senator Manchin and Senator Sinema, 2 targets. Did the Biden administration matter as a target? Yes, they needed support and to know that they had the backing that if they kept pushing on this, that would be well received and that the American public would be happy about the result. But in the end, when you have 2 targets, that's hard for campaigning, right? It means that every little variable about what motivates those targets blows up in importance. And it also means that there is, in a way, there's just less direct pressure and persuasion for people in the public to do. We could send 100,000 people from around the country to go sit in front of Joe Manchin's house in West Virginia, but that wouldn't help. So I think that that also made the storytelling, I think, kind of harder. When I say storytelling, I'm talking the storytelling about the process. The storytelling about the content, we had and have many great stories. We told the stories about what will it look like when we create all these jobs, when We are actually lifting up the economy while we are cutting emissions, and we're building something for the future.
So how did that play, like in the context of the IRA campaign? What were those ups and downs? Were there points when it was clear, oh, we've got to adjust the strategy to deal with this. We've got to adjust the strategy to deal with that?
I think it was really the narrowing of the targets and getting the IJA, passed. The bipartisan infrastructure bill got passed. And so then there was a whole lot more work to do that wasn't going to happen in that manner. But that was when that narrowing strategy became important. IRA was challenging because the story was, it was like the final seasons of The Walking Dead. It was just kind of the same darn thing over and over and over, right? Which is following things in the political press and following things through whatever on the ground intel that we have and different holdups on different parts of the potential legislation, different whispers in the wind about whether there was still openness amongst the targets to move this forward. And it really blurred together, I think, for a lot of folks. And there was a lot of activist fatigue. For sure. I mean, you have people saying, how many more times do you want me to send an email to Joe Biden? He's with us. Why,
Right.
why am I doing this? And then, there was a lot of people ever just figuring out, well, what can I do to influence Senator Manchin and Senator Sinema, even though I don't live in their state? What can I do? And sadly, some of the time, the answer was not a whole lot. The haze in the barn, we've set this up across the country among the public as an important and good thing to do. And from here on out, it is going to be a lot of internal wrangling for quite a while.
This must come up and has come up in other campaigns where you've won the support of a bunch of legislators already, and now you're down to two, and Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema are two really difficult targets because Kyrsten Sinema is sort of following the McCain tradition of presenting as a maverick and not being predictable, and Joe Manchin is just a longtime supporter of coal and not much of a fan of doing anything about the climate.
And in a very challenging political position to
Right.
be the Democratic senator from West Virginia
Right.
is he, outperforming there. So
Exactly. It's not a state where environmentalists have a lot of sway. How do you deal with that kind of situation where your targets are just really, really tough, either because personally or they're hard to influence?
this is a place where campaigning only gets you so far. Sometimes public pressure and visibility is not the strategy that you need to deploy at a certain time to win. And that's just the fact of the matter. So I do think it is very important when you're thinking of running a campaign, when you're creating a campaign, to think about that. I have seen cases where maybe someone thought we needed a big campaign on something when that wasn't a good use of resources. We could get it done other ways. But, in the case of IRA, it really did come down to a lot of just really on the ball, tough, persistent negotiation internally with leadership. We know all this. Sometimes the best we can do with campaigning is create that backdrop and that background so that we're continuing to push that people want this, that this has benefits for those targets, for, everyone around the country, and just keep banging that drum. And the problem is that people's hands get tired from all that banging. I just think that's something really important to think about. And, next time I find myself engaged in a fight that may spin out this way, I'll be thinking a lot about it. I'll be thinking a lot about what do we do if it feels like everything's getting mired down? How do we channel people's energy into meaningful action? Because the average person can see through busy work. What can we find that's a meaningful way to help with the effort and be able to be patient while some other things spin out? A time frame for goals, right? That frame is, there is a tipping point. There are tipping points after which we can't do anything. And that is true. It's what the science tells us. But increasingly, I'm not sure we should lead with that when we're communicating. There was a time when that was very front and center, a big part of our messaging. And this relates to how do you keep people engaged when there might be some slow periods in your work. We know now that statement is not actually super motivating towards action. People, right? We've learned that doomerisms, talking about how bad it could be and how urgent and dire it is, actually makes people shut down a little bit. We know that now really the formula is conveying urgency, but also conveying agency, conveying that we have it within our power to change this. I actually would rather run a campaign around how much clean energy can we get online? How many kilowatt hours? Let's put that big old thermometer on the wall and let's fill that thermometer in. And you can set up incremental progress points like that in campaign. It's not always easy. I mean, sometimes we really are talking about a binary, yes or no. But I think a lot of the time, within the context of the bigger campaign, we can also set up moments where people can take meaningful action and actually see a thermometer rise somewhere.
So have there been times when you've been working on a campaign and your assessment is the outcome that we wanted to achieve, policy or whatever, the odds are just low that we're going to be able to get that. So let's think about what's that intermediary thing that we can go for that still puts points on the board and moves us forward and is achievable.
I think that fracking is a great example of that. So, the rallying cry for a very long time has been, for many, a national ban on fracking. No more fracking, not even no new fracking, like, shut down what's there. And that is challenging. That's hard on a political level. It's also hard on a process level because, the federal government actually isn't really the president isn't really in a position to actually just like with a stroke of a pen ban fracking. There's a lot of steps that, so there's a political barrier. There's a kind of a process, a legal barrier to that. But boy, did we show there's a whole lot you can do to make fracking less common and safer and emitting less global warming gases. And, and that is everything from making sure that individual communities have the ability to and do, adopt ordinances around setbacks, not fracking around schools. And in some cases saying we just don't want fracking to happen within the borders of our community. Things around chemical safety and right to know what chemicals are involved. Basically, regulation. Safety and health regulation. At times there is a tendency, I think, for people to balk against that kind of incremental progress because they feel, and I've heard this, that well, that way everyone will say, well, we fixed it and we'll never get our ban on fracking. And to that, I say, well, it may be 100 years before you can get a ban on fracking. So do you want to make some progress? And do you want to keep people engaged for the long term? Do you want to show them that, we were worried about this, the global warming impacts, the public health impacts, the impact on our water and our air and our wildlife and all of that? What if we could start to fix that and count those as victories? I think that's really important. I mean, first of all, because they are victories, because that is starting to fix problems. But then secondly, because it's creating a direct impact. It's letting people feel success. And if we set up our campaigns so that doesn't feel like success, we aren't going to keep people around. That kind of the time frame and the feasibility of your goals are really important for both actually creating an impact in the world, but also for keeping people engaged because they feel like I'm going out, I'm doing all these things, I'm rallying at the White House and something's happening. I'm seeing a change in the world because of something I did. People need to feel that, and they really deserve to, I think, if they are, volunteering and being active on these campaigns.
That's a great observation. What are some of the other elements that a campaign strategist needs to account for and manage?
Constructing your buckets of tactics that are the way you're implementing your strategy is really important. And I think, kind of striking the balance between being nimble and being able to respond, rapidly and adjust tactically rapidly. Maybe you want to spend a bunch of money on advertising and you had chosen 5 key states where there are key targets to deploy that advertising, and then something happens and a target changes. Building in the ability to move that around, being able to plan around uncertainty and say, well, in the end, we're going to have the resources to really hit 5 states with this advertising. And we think these are the 5, but we're willing to roll with it if it turns out that changes. But also to to have a solid strategy and just keep on keeping on through the twists and the turns. I think movement building is really about that. It's like, no matter what happens here, we are adding people, we are increasing their skills, their engagement. And if we lose this one, we have built more of a base. And if we've done our job right, they're engaged and they're ready for the next fight as well. That's really important. And I would like to underscore that the best campaign plan in the world goes nowhere without proper organization of your team. And a real tight ship, I think, is very important. Kurt Vonnegut actually has written a lot about this, about his belief that basically, progressive causes ought to be run like the mafia, minus the bad parts. I'm just saying, tight ship, and I absolutely agree with that. My brother is a combat vet. He was an Army Ranger. And I've talked with him a lot about, how we work and found out that there's a lot in common running our kind of campaign and running a successful military effort. And I think, there's something to that.
What does it look like in a campaign to have a tight ship?
Everyone knows their roles. Everyone knows their responsibilities. There is frequent communication and very clear deliverables of everybody. They adjust, they change, but everybody's got to come in that day knowing what they are supposed to have and having priorities around. What am I delivering today? I'm turning out 50 people to something. I am getting this flight of ads finalized and ready to go. I really believe that running campaigns in a pretty hierarchical fashion just has always works well for me.
This doesn't happen so much within an organization as amongst organizations, but sometimes there's a culture amongst multiple groups that's like nobody wants to be seen as too pushy or, thinking that they're the leader. And so you end up having a lot of groups that are sort of timid in laying out, here's things we could do, or here's things we should do. And I think it really impedes progress.
I think that's true. And, on the flip side, it's not always beneficial for someone to bulldoze in and say, this is my plan. I'm going to go make it happen. I don't care. The best leaders go in maybe with a pretty good idea where they think it's going, but a total openness to hear from other experts around the table, their thoughts, and to synthesize that into a plan that everyone sees themselves in and agrees with. Not going in with a totally empty mind and blank slate. Like, what are people going to tell me? It's going in with a hypothesis, but being willing to adjust that hypothesis based on what you hear from your colleagues. But then being someone that is willing to say, okay, I think we're done talking here. Is this the plan? I think this is the plan. Do we all agree that this is the plan?
Is there something that we haven't touched on that you think tends to get overlooked when people plan campaigns?
Planning for the unexpected. I've talked about that a little bit, but being comfortable with the unexpected, but having a framework around it. Most basic example of this is a lot of organizations and companies, entities have a rapid response protocol. Something happens in the world, nobody saw it coming, or at least didn't see that specific thing coming at this specific moment. We have to decide how we respond. We have a clear protocol. It's these 5 people are going to come together and decide what to do. And then that decision is going to get implemented clearly by these other people. That's really easy. And it's really easy to set up, but actually people don't always set that up. And then there's a little fog of war thing on, whoa, some bomb just got thrown into our strategy and we need this person and do we need this person? And we get 50 people in a room and it's not clear who's in charge. And there isn't a real clear structure to how we're making a decision and we get a little bogged down. So I think that having a very good plan for rapid response is good. A fundamental skill or principle of campaigning escalation, right? Say we want a corporation to do X. First, we send them a nice letter. We ask them nicely. Mm-hmm. And then if they blow us off or don't respond, we ask them a little less nicely. And then we show up and then we, take other measures that are, we're increasingly raising the temperature. But we're starting at a low temperature because, some of the time you actually do just get what you want by asking nicely and having millions of people behind you that are kind of ready to roll if they say no. So I think building escalation in terms of your tactical approach, your strategy, your budget. Okay, if we have to escalate, what is our plan? Are we budgeted? Are we raising money around that escalation? Are we ready? Are we prepared to do that on the right time frame? Preparing for escalation, I think, is great. And then part of that is having an exit strategy. What happens if we actually find out that we're not going to be able to accomplish this? Because that happens. How do we tell that story? How does that story end for everyone that's involved in a way that isn't, this effort just disappeared? It can't be like that.
Another way to think about influencing targets is with an economics framework in terms of how much is it going to cost this decision maker to do what you're asking? How much is it going to cost them to not do what you're asking? Usually we're not the ones with like millions of dollars and lots of lobbyists and other ways of, let's just say, getting decisions that we'd like to have. It's often about how big a burr under the saddle can you make your efforts and your campaign to the point where that decision maker is just like, it would just be easier to do this and get these people off my back.
And, remember, even with targets with whom you maybe have a more adversarial relationship, sometimes you can create a hero opportunity or create an opportunity for them to not only get you off their back by doing the thing you want them to do, but maybe they get a little bonus of a little applause and a little bit of a thank you. I think it is important to thank the people who do the things we ask them to do.
That's right.
That's a nice thing to do.
We want them to get used to the idea that there are benefits. You never want to just have somebody in a corner. There's nowhere for them to go, because when people are in that situation, then they just absolutely resist.
A lot of the time, we don't think enough about creating a soft place to land.
Right.
If we set it up, this opponent is evil, they're doing the wrong thing. If they don't do the right, you need them to feel like, well, if I do this thing, I won't just not be yelled at for being the devil. I will be praised for doing a good thing, because indeed they will have done a good thing. Finding that soft landing place is important.
Kind of fitting that and the exit strategy together and preparing for contingencies. There's The question of, is there an accountability protocol? Do you have a consistent approach to, once the vote's taken, there are going to be some who voted with you and some who voted against, and how you treat them after that vote really matters. You want to do something positive for the people who backed your cause, and you want to figure out, how do we create some political disincentive for those who voted against us? Because there's going to be a next time in all likelihood, and others will observe what happened. If people shoot down our agenda and then there's no real consequence for them, well, consequences are really important.
I believe in everybody according to the setup of their organization. I believe in having a roped, consistent accountability program. The consistency really matters. I think that there are definitely moments when a big splash in one place matters, making an example to others of the praise or the anti-praise that you couldn't receive for going the right way or the wrong way on these types of decisions. There are times when making an example of somebody with a really big action, a big spend, can have an impact, but really consistency is important. It's part of a relationship that your organization or your movement, your coalition builds with lawmakers. They know that if they do the right thing, they're going to get thanked. Or on the flip side, they know if they do the wrong thing, they are going to get spanked. And making that part of their cost-benefit analysis can be done by making it very consistent.
What's some advice that you got from a mentor or a colleague that influenced you and that you want to pass along?
Don't piss people off unless you need to. I don't think that Bill Snape will mind if I use his name, who was one of my mentors at the Center for Biological Diversity, a great attorney, a great advocate, especially for public lands and wildlife and the climate. So Bill told me that when I was a young whippersnapper policy advocate on the Hill, and I take it with me every day. And of course, it's corollary, but piss off people if you need to.
That's great. That's great. Is there something that you know now that you wish you'd learned earlier? And if you could go back and tell your earlier self.
I am 45 years old now, and something that I think became extremely clear to me during COVID, and is kind of very clear to me now, is that self-care is important. I sense that the next generation coming up in this work, the Zoomers, actually understand that better than we did at their age. I see that with the folks from that generation that I work with, but it's really important. And, your mental health is an important resource for you to be able to keep doing this work long term. And a lot of the work that we do is draining for a lot of reasons, not just because it's hard, but because every day you're confronted with the horrors that could await if we're not successful. And that's really hard. So, I think building a routine around whatever, for me, it is running and exercise and meditation and spending time with my family. I've got to make time for that. And I wish I would have made more time for that earlier in my life and career.
Yeah, I can relate to that. Last, is there an organization that you think is doing great work that you'd like to just lift up and call attention to?
I am going to have to lift up Sandy Hook Promise. That's the organization that I joined just a couple of months ago. It was founded by survivors, parents of the Sandy Hook elementary school shooting. I have been so impressed working with them, and I was just so over the moon to be able to join their work, because the work they're doing is so effective at getting at the root causes of gun violence in schools. So you can find them at sandyhookpromise.org and learn all about the work they're doing, on the ground and when it comes to policy to prevent gun violence.
Melissa, thank you so much. This has been so much fun. Great to talk to you. And it's funny, despite how many years we worked together, never digging into this subject in quite this granular way.
A little more formal, and then probably a few fewer curse words than our usual
yes, a little bit.
Conversations. I enjoyed it a lot.
What we're going to be watched. Thank you, Melissa.
Great talking with you.
Hey, have a great weekend.
All right, you too. Catch you later, man.
Thanks for tuning into The Campaign Strategist, where we dive into the art and science of advocacy. The podcast is produced by Prismatic Strategies to share wisdom and insights from leaders in the field. I'm your host, Pete Altman. Music was written by Andrea Perry and Pete Altman, and this is edited by Abby Altman. If you enjoyed today's episode, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with others who care about making a difference. You can find us wherever you get your podcast. Thanks again, and see you next time.